This will be another lesson in the category that we're calling Exhibit C, Comparative Anatomy. We'll learn about structures called vestigial structures. These are parts of an organism, like an animal or plant, that don't seem to have current function. Now, you'll recall Christians in Darwin's time believed that God had intelligently designed all the different kinds of adaptations found in plants and animals. Well, what if we find parts that don't seem to have a function? Would that challenge the Christian view? How could that be evidence of intelligent design? In fact, it would weaken the God hypothesis. You'll recall in the 1800s in England, the design argument was embraced by many naturalists. These were Christian ideas. In fact, William Paley was a very influential Christian writer. He wrote a book called Natural Theology, and he asks us to imagine walking down a path and we find a watch. Well, we inspect the watch. It's got all these little parts working together, and now the thing tells time. Well, we certainly wouldn't conclude that this watch was just laying there for a really long time, that somehow nature produced this watch. No, it's got parts with purpose and therefore had to have an intelligent designer. Well, so too with all the animals and plants that have adaptations. So the design argument basically is saying when you find parts with purpose, it must have had an intelligent designer. So then what about parts with no purpose? What are we to make of that? Now, we've encountered the Galapagos Islands before. Of course, Darwin made a famous journey to the islands and studied the geology and the animals and plants there. And here's a map from a tourist company showing some of the islands and then the different kinds of animals that you might see on those islands. We're going to focus on Fernandina and Isabella. There's a really interesting species that lives there. It's called the Galapagos cormorant. And this is what it looks like. Now the bird has wings, but it cannot fly. So the wings and musculature are incapable of producing enough aerodynamic lift. Of course, flight is a common way birds escape predators. Interestingly, on the Galapagos Islands, there are no predators. And we'll return to that observation a little later. So we seem to have then a part with no purpose. Now, why would God make this bird with wings that didn't work? This was the kind of challenge Darwin had in mind when thinking about these structures, parts with no purpose. So Darwin thought the discovery of parts with no purpose weakened the Christian view that God intelligently designed animals before making them. After all, why would God make birds with wings that did not function? Darwin had another explanation for parts with no purpose. Now, the Galapagos cormorant, of course, it can't fly, but it feeds in the oceans. It catches a variety of sea creatures like fish and octopi and eels and so on. It's got very powerful leg muscles, and the webbing here helps it propel itself through the water. It's got powerful kicking motions here, and it's a really good swimmer. In addition, having smaller wings reduces drag in the water, creating a more streamlined body shape. So it's actually an advantage then to have small wings here when you're feeding in this way. If we look at the skeleton structure, the bird on the left here, this is the mainland cormorant. It is a powerful flyer. It's got a large keel. That's a part of the bone here for the attachment of large flight muscles. Notice the Galapagos cormorant has no keel, really, and the wing bones are much smaller. So we can definitely see a significant difference in the skeletal structure between these two species. So for Darwin, the idea is a species like this one on the left, the mainland cormorant, migrated to the Galapagos Islands and then was sculpted by the new environment into the new species. And here again, this is the process of natural selection. So for Darwin, the case of the Galapagos cormorant illustrates one of Darwin's basic arguments that species can multiply. So new species emerge from pre-existing species. The South American cormorant species gave rise to a new daughter species, but continued to exist in South America. New species can arise when members of the ancestral species enter a new environment, like the Galapagos Islands, and evolve different traits. So in this case, the bird lost the ability to fly. Its wings got smaller and smaller. That was the effect of the evolutionary process of natural selection. on that population of cormorants on the Galapagos Islands. Now, we encountered our bracket diagrams in a previous lesson on natural selection. Let's use it to help us understand the evolution of the Galapagos cormorant. Here we again have the parents and we have offspring showing variation. In this case, we're interested in wing size. Notice we're putting the smaller winged bird up here on the top. This is the one that's going to have an advantage. Again, why would it be an advantage? Because it can swim better. So the smaller wings reduce the drag in the water. Larger wings means that you're a less efficient swimmer. So again, since there's no predators, now any variations that reduce wing size won't be penalized because there are no predators. And in fact, there's a positive selection force, positive selection pressure on smaller wings. And then you get heredity, of course. This has to be DNA-based variation. So we get the survivors passing on this trait, but notice there's new variation each generation. And then selection continues to favor the smallest winged individuals, and they pass on their beneficial trait. And so we get this evolutionary process where the wings are evolving to a smaller and smaller size. So new adaptations evolved to meet the demands of the new lifestyle. In this case, the species lost an adaptation because it was disadvantageous. Now, Darwin called the non-functional wings vestigial structures. In general, vestigial structures were adaptations in ancestor species, but lost their usefulness in a new environment or evolutionary context. For this case, Darwin would argue that wings did work in the continental ancestors, but when the cormorants reached the Galapagos Islands, natural selection stopped favoring large wings. Mutations that reduced wing size were no longer penalized because there were no predators to eat the birds with non-functioning wings. Because cormorants now had to feed in the ocean, smaller wings became an advantage in reducing drag while swimming. After many generations of variation, selection, heredity, the birds lost their ability to fly. So for Darwin, vestigial structures weaken the design argument. They are evidence of species change. Let's quickly introduce another example. Here we have a fish. Of course, like most fish, they have eyes that allow them to detect reflected light in their environment, and that can be really handy. You can find food, get away from predators, find mates, etc. But there are species of fish that live in caves where there's no light, and you often find species that are blind in those environments. Now, this again is curious because the blind cavefish often do have some eye parts, but they don't have a functioning eye. Now, why would you have any eye parts at all? Again, this would be a puzzle for the Christian worldview. Why would God make fish that have some eye parts that don't work? Well, the Darwinian explanation here would be the ancestor was a fish that had sight, it had eyes, fully functioning eyes, and some of them entered into a new environment. They started to find new resources in the caves. Of course, some of those ancestral fish continued to be the ones with the working eyes, but as the population spent time in the caves, mutations accumulated that took away the function of the eyes, that started to degrade vision. Now, we might ask the questions, why not maintain the eyes, and what is the advantage to losing the eyes? Well, eyes take energy to build and maintain, and eyes can get infected. So these are two costs to having eyes. So if now the fish are living in the dark caves and there's no benefit to having eyes, but you have these two costs to having eyes, natural selection will begin to favor mutations that take away the eyes. There are, in fact, examples of vestigial structures in humans. We have these ear muscles behind the ears. Again, we don't really sort of need them in our current lives, but the idea is our ancestors were using these ear muscles. We have molars, and oftentimes people get them extracted. We don't seem to need these molars. Of course, there's the appendix. Again, you can live perfectly well without an appendix. We've got the tail bones here. So vestigial structures are common throughout nature. So for Darwin then, vestigial structures, again, weaken the design argument. Why would God make these creatures that have parts with no purpose? Well, that would be fully explained if the ancestors had those working parts, and then there was a change in the evolutionary context. And then natural selection shifted to favoring mutations that took away the parts, leaving only rudimentary parts, vestigial parts that no longer had a purpose.